In this session, we will look at some options on how to produce a national activity classification and how ISIC can be used in the process. We know that there is no legal framework that requires all countries to use ISIC as it is, and we know that countries have different needs when producing their own national statistics. So we will look at some of the options that exist in using ISIC as a basis for the development of the national classification, and we will look at some of the difficulties that may arise in the process. If we look back at the origins of ISIC, created in 1948, we can see that ISIC always had two goals. On one hand, it was supposed to provide a tool for international comparison. On the other hand, however, it was supposed to provide guidance to countries in the development of a national activity classification structure. So of course, over time, ISIC has been periodically revised, has been updated to keep it always relevant with economic developments. And as an effect of this process, we of course see an increasing need for detailed data that has led to more and more detailed versions of ISIC. When we try to develop the structure of a national classification, what are the different approaches that we can take? Number one, of course, is using ISIC as a starting point. ISIC is an international classification that has a very developed structure, a lot of detail that is applicable to most countries in the world. The second option would be to base our work on historical versions of the national classification that have been around probably for many years, have been customized to national specifics. And the third option would be to start completely from scratch. We develop new concepts that we want to embed in the classification. We build it up from these probably new concepts and see what the resulting structure will be. Of course, in this session, we want to look only at the option of using ISIC as a starting point, because the others would be really different from country to country, and we of course are more concerned with international comparability and using common approaches. If we're using ISIC as a basis for our work of developing a structure for a national classification, we can take, of course, different approaches with different levels of adherence to the original ISIC structure. The first and easiest option actually is to adopt the ISIC structure as it is, without making any modifications. We actually see quite a number of countries around the world that use this approach. It's not really a surprise, because ISIC is a fairly developed classification. It has a logical structure with more than 400 categories, which is sufficient for describing the economy in many countries around the world. The second approach would be to use the complete ISIC structure and add subdivisions to reflect nationally important industries, but still maintain the ISIC coding structure. So essentially what we can then do is we can take the national classification and numerically truncate it back to ISIC. If we look at an example here, we just take 3 of the ISIC categories and subdivide them into more detailed categories at the national level, where apparently there is a need to produce more detailed information on these different activities. And we see we're using the ISIC coding system as it is and simply add an additional digit. So that allows us to subdivide each of the ISIC categories into up to 9 different categories for national purposes. And to convert back or to compare the data from a national version to the international standard, all we have to do is truncate the code of the national classification, and the remaining 4 digits actually give us the link to the ISIC classification. So it's really an extension by simply adding in a consistent way of coding, adding more detail to the classification. An example of this approach is the Philippine Standard Industrial Classification of 2009, which has been developed based on ISIC revision 4. As one example, we have the category 0116, the growing of fiber crops, in the agriculture section of ISIC, that has been subdivided into more detailed national categories, reflecting the growing of different types of fiber crops that are important for producing statistics at the national level. Another example would be the Standard Industrial Classification of Norway. If we look at ISIC, at this particular example, we see that there's one category that covers all sea and coastal freight water transport. However, Norway has a very long coastline and water transport is a very important industry in the country. So to produce meaningful statistics, to have just one category that covers all of these activities would not be sufficient. So therefore, for national purposes, Norway has introduced 4 subdivisions of this category that describe separate components of freight water transport that have to be measured in the country to produce meaningful statistics. So together with the previous example, we can see that this type of modification of ISIC by adding more detail makes sense every time we have an industry in a country that is very important and where we need to produce more detailed statistics. For instance, the example for Norway here, this type of breakdown, would not be useful for countries that have not a very long coastline. For instance, Nepal or Bhutan would certainly not need this type of category. So it's really an extension that we make at the national level, but to bring it into the international level would be too much burden for most of the countries to do. The next option that we have when we're using ISIC as a basis for the development of our national classification structure is similar to the previous one, but we're not extending the coding structure. We are making some changes here, for instance, as we do in the European activity classification, which means that it requires a correspondence table, but it has some other advantage. This example shows us a part of the relation between ISIC revision 4 and NACE revision 2, and we can see that NACE has introduced more detail here. For example, in the very first category, where ISIC has just one class, NACE introduces 5 classes for this type of manufacturing activity. You may recall that on a previous slide, I have actually shown the same kind of relationship between ISIC and a national classification structure with the same type of industries. But the coding system was different. On the other slide, we have used a coding system with 5 digits that has always added 1 digit to the ISIC code. Here, in the case of NACE, we don't do this. What are the advantages of actually using the approach that we see here? Well, there are 2. One is we can still keep a shorter code for our work in the classification structure. Here in NACE, we're also using just a 4-digit code instead of using a 5-digit code that we get when we always add additional digits to the ISIC coding system. A second advantage is that this gives us an option of sometimes elevating certain industries to a higher level. If we look at the second line in this short table here, we have the manufacture of refractory products, which in ISIC is an industry at the 4-digit level of the classification, while in NACE it is actually an industry at the 3rd level of the classification. So this actually gives countries an option to elevate some of the industries that they think are very important in their country and need special treatment or need more visibility in their statistics, to elevate them to a higher level of the classification by using these small modifications in the coding system. We still see that if we use the same definitions, we have full compliance with the ISIC structure. However, we need a correspondence table to actually convert data from the national classification to ISIC. We cannot, as in the other example, simply use a truncation of the national codes. So this is a valid option, and it often proves quite useful when we feel that there are certain industries in the country that we need to give more visibility in our statistics. The fourth option that we want to look at in terms of using ISIC as a basis for developing a national classification structure would be to combine nationally less important ISIC categories. For instance, combine ISIC categories at a 2 or 3-digit level. An example for this is the Singapore Standard Industrial Classification. If we look at ISIC in the area of forestry and logging, we see that we have 4 classes subdividing these activities. We have the management of forests, we have logging, we have the gathering of forest products, and of course the support services to forestry. If we look at the geographic situation of Singapore, we will realize that forestry is not a main activity in this country. So therefore it makes no sense for Singapore to provide subdivided categories for these different aspects of forestry and logging activities. Most likely also because we do not have separate statistical units that provide these different activities to the country. Therefore, in Singapore, all the forestry and logging activities have been combined in just one category. Of course, the different approaches for deriving a national classification structure can also be mixed. This here is just a theoretical example, but it applies in a very similar way to many countries that have started to use ISIC as a basis for their development. In the first case, we see that additional detail has been introduced in a certain part of the classification, while in the next two lines, we see that because there's less of a national importance of these activities, two categories have been combined. A more common example is the situation where we don't want to completely collapse a given section of the classification, as in the example of Singapore that we have just seen, but where we want to reduce the number of items within a section. Let's look at the raising of animals as an example. In group 014, we have 6 separate classes for specific types of animals: cattle, horses, camels, sheep, pigs, and poultry, as well as a residual class for all other types of animals. A country may review this list and say, yes, these are categories that we need, since raising of chicken, pigs, and cattle is important in our economy. However, we do not have anyone raising camels, or at least there are so few that they are not economically relevant, and we don't need that class. What can we do in such a case? Combining everything just into the group raising of animals would not be useful, since we need to maintain some of these classes. Can we just delete the class 0143 and say it doesn't exist? The answer is no. Since there may still be some small production, now or in the future, we need to maintain a place in the classification for this type of activity. That means that we have to include the contents of this class in another class of the classification. There are essentially two options. Option A, we combine this activity with another class, except for the residual category. Of course, this would change the scope of the other category, although only slightly, and we must indicate this change. That could be done either by changing the title or the explanatory note of the class. Changing the title may be too much of a change for such a small move. Remember that we are trying to eliminate a very small category from this classification. Unless the class we want to eliminate is very similar in nature to another neighboring class, we do not recommend this approach. In this particular example, none of the other animals can be meaningfully combined with camels, so we should not use this option here. That leaves us with the better option B. We include this activity in the residual category. This makes sense since the class we want to eliminate is small. We don't have to change the title since camels are now other animals, since they don't belong to the classes for cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, or chicken. It would be useful, of course, in this case to add a line in the explanatory note of the class 0149 that says raising of camels to clarify the change. This would then leave us with the following structure. There is another option to make a change in the structure visible when we combine categories. In this example, let's assume that the classes for the repair of electrical equipment and the repair of electronic equipment are very small, but combined they would still represent a sizable category that we would consider relevant for our country. In this case, we would not involve the residual category, but instead combine 3313 and 3314. This could look like this. No other classes than the one highlighted would be affected. Now, to make it more visible that a change in scope has taken place, we could wish to avoid reusing an existing code number. To do that, we could take a new unused code number for this new class, for instance, like this. This is a method that we can sometimes see in the revision of the harmonized system. Of course, this can only be done if there are unused codes available, which may very much limit the number of cases where this is really an option. If we make a combination with a residual category, however, then this rule should not apply, since we still have a residual category, just with a larger scope, that should still have a code ending in 9. Now, when we do look at these different activities, do they all have the same impact when we look at international comparability? Of course, the answer is not really. For the first three, where we're actually using ISIC as it is, or we're introducing more detail, we still maintain a full comparability with ISIC at all levels of the classification. So we can really compare data across all countries in the world for all the categories in ISIC. If we're using this last option, where we're elevating some of the lower level categories, combine some activities in the national classification, we of course maintain a comparability with ISIC only at higher levels. So this is something to be taken into account, that it may seem reasonable at the national level to do it, but we are paying the price in terms of a lowered international comparability. We have now looked at the different options that can be used for developing a national classification structure when using ISIC as a basis. So just a few words on what is happening when we're using a historical national classification as a basis for this work. Well, we always have to be aware that using a non-ISIC based classification will always create difficulties for international comparison. We will always have to use correspondence tables to compare data from one classification to the other, or from one country to the other. And one big problem that we see is that we have a limit on data comparability between these classifications due to partial links that will almost always exist in such correspondence tables. So while countries, of course, are free to use historical classifications as a basis for their work, especially since these historical classifications may have long applications in the countries and reflect the national specifics in the economic structure, we're always encouraging efforts to line the historical versions up to ISIC. This, of course, can be done at detailed level only, without considering the aggregation structures in ISIC. This allows us to be more consistent in terms of the detailed definitions that we're using at the most detailed levels of the classification. But it can also be done step by step by lining up individual sections of the classifications. We have now looked at how we can add or reduce detail in the classification and how to make this visible in the coding system. The big question that remains, of course, is still what detail should actually be considered. The United Nations Statistical Commission actually recommends that detailed categories of a national classification can be rearranged and aggregated so that they correspond with the 2-digit level of ISIC without loss of data. Of course, this is just a high-level comparability requirement, and it doesn't really address the question of how detailed does the national classification have to be. And we are, of course, aware that most statistics and most users will require more in terms of international comparability, even at lower levels. So what we know, of course, is that countries might want to add details for industries of particular importance to the national economy, like some of the examples that we have seen. And countries might want to remove detail for reasons involving size and relevance, confidentiality, or homogeneity in these particular areas of the classification. We should also be aware that the classification for the collection of data may be more detailed than for the distribution of data. Using more detail for the collection right now actually allows for future adjustments if individual industries are growing. The level of detail for publishing, of course, depends on the type of statistics. And in this sense, the most detailed requirements for statistics to be published affect the need for the classification detail, or granularity as it is often called. So overall, there are no fixed guidelines that exist for the proper choice of detail, but there are some methods that have been used in the past, and we're going to look at some of these examples now. Let's look at 3 approaches that can help us in determining the level of detail that we want to introduce in the national classification. The first one we would call the formal approach. It works by choosing a certain variable, like the number of statistical units, or the number of employees, or value added. And based on this variable, we compute a ratio between what is found within the category and the average among the siblings. Siblings are categories that are at the same level of the classification, but within the same higher level category in the classification. So depending on the size of this ratio, we will decide on whether to delete or keep or split this category that we had considered. There are a number of drawbacks, of course. The first one is that it's hard to define these different levels or weights. Why do we make a decision based on the value of the ratio greater or smaller than 1.5? Why is this border not set at 1.3 or 1.7? So this is a bit of an arbitrary value that will give us different results. We will also get different results if we use different variables. So if we do this calculation based on the number of statistical units, we may get a different result than choosing the number of employees as the basis for our calculation. Of course, the level of detail in that category, in the classification in this area, also influences the outcome. And one important issue here is also that this approach ignores dynamic aspects. So it's based on information that is available at a certain point of time, but does not consider any future changes that we expect in this particular part of the classification in the coming years. The second approach we would call the homogeneity-based approach, because it's based on the homogeneity ratios, which includes the specialization ratio and the coverage ratio. The specialization ratio of an industry is the output by that industry of goods and services characteristic to that industry in proportion to its total output. On the other hand, the coverage ratio is the output of goods or services characteristic to this industry in proportion to the total production of the same goods and services by the economy as a whole. Based on these ratios, we would compress or expand the classification. There are, of course, some serious drawbacks, and one is there is not enough usable data usually available to make this type of calculation that can be used to really have a clear distinction between expansion or compression requirements for the classification. We also have no definitive and mutually exclusive definition of characteristic products for each of the activities. The third approach we call the pragmatic approach, which is based on input from data users, but also takes into account special concerns such as confidentiality, extra reporting burden, and growing industries. In this approach, new subclasses are only created if there's a user demand for them. However, data users must justify their needs for splits, estimate the number of affected units and turnovers, and do this not only based on the current situation, but also take into account future expectations in these areas. Of course, confidentiality and extra reporting burden have to be taken into account. We also have to note that there are no strict thresholds. So for instance, if we consider the number of affected units as a criterion, we're not applying the same number in all areas of the classification. Drawbacks to this approach are, of course, that there are challenging and intense discussions, and we will not always be able to meet all user needs. These are quite distinct approaches, but what seems to be most workable is to use the pragmatic approach and complement it in certain areas of the classification where data is available with information that can be obtained through the formal or homogeneity-based approach. When we discuss the detail that we want to introduce in our national classification, we will always be confronted by growing demands from users for more and more detailed statistics, so for more and more detailed classifications. But there are limitations, and we have to be aware of the implications of a more detailed classification system. It may be more difficult to establish clear and understandable and workable definitions for the detailed categories. The number of classification errors may increase, resulting in less reliable statistics. Surveys will require larger samples, and the cost of data collection generally will increase. A very important question to consider in this context is, do the statistical units show sufficient specialization to support a more detailed classification? This goes back to the issue of homogeneity ratios that we looked at on the previous screen. Examples exist in many areas of the classification, but agriculture is one where we have quite a few of these examples. If we take a look, for instance, at ISIC class 0124, growing of pome fruits and stone fruits. This includes the growing of apples, the growing of pears, and a number of other fruits. Now, I may be tempted to have separate categories in my country for the growing of apples and for the growing of pears. However, I may discover that in my country, every agricultural unit that grows apples also grows pears. In such a case, it would not be useful to have two separate categories, as the units that are involved in the growing of apples and pears will most likely not be consistently classified to these two different categories. Finally, let's look at a few issues that come up when we talk about structuring a new classification. The ISIC structure and definitions are based on a few criteria, namely input, process, output, and the use of outputs. The question that sometimes comes up is, Should other criteria be added for national purposes? For example, should we have separate categories for private and public entities? Should we have separate categories in the classification for manufacturing by hand, so crafts, versus manufacturing by machines? Should we have separate categories for national versus foreign-owned companies? The problem here is that these are cross-classifications and they should actually be treated as such. So there should be a separate classification that separates, for instance, private versus public entities, and it should not be built into the classification of activities itself. However, in limited cases, it may be acceptable to incorporate this type of distinction in the main structure, even though the concepts break. And I think we would only recommend this if it applies only to a few categories in ISIC. If it's a distinction that has to be made across all economic activities, we would not recommend to have this in the ISIC structure itself, but rather treat it as a cross-classification with another dimension. The question here, of course, is always what are the applications of this type of distinction, and that will determine how big the impact on the classification is and how many categories would be affected. The following point was already included on the previous slide, but I want to repeat it because it's very important. The issue is to always avoid the unnecessary addition of detail. There is often a demand, but we always have to ask ourselves, does the intended form of specialization actually exist? Can distinctions really be made in a reliable way? Otherwise, it is not possible to produce meaningful statistics from detail that cannot be observed in practice. Sometimes there may be the opinion that a certain activity does not exist in a country, or it is not visible, and there's a desire to restructure the classification by simply skipping that code and renumbering the remaining categories in the ISIC structure. Now, the recommendation would of course be, when following the ISIC structure and the coding system, do not renumber codes if you want to skip a code number. There are two issues related to it. One is, regardless of legality, size, or other concerns, this activity is still within the conceptual scope, and it must be accounted for in the system of national accounts. So there are two options. You could keep the activity in the classification, you just don't publish data on it, or you combine it with another activity. That, of course, as in the examples that we have seen earlier, would have an impact on international comparability. Also, the renumbering would actually make the ISIC link less intuitive. We will still be able to convert data in a reliable way, but the intuitive link gets lost. I would like to end this session with two comments on rules for good housekeeping. So these are not fixed rules that everybody has to follow, but it makes it a bit easier to understand, to intuitively understand the codes that are being used in the classification. The first comment is on not subdividing a category. If we have a category at a certain level of the classification that is not further subdivided, the code at the next lower level, which has the same scope, should use the same code with a 0 appended. So that means every time I look at a code and I see a 0 at the end, I know that it has the same code as the category above. The second comment is on the use of the digit 9 for residual categories. Residual categories are often defined not in a very strict way, but rather as everything else that is not included in the previous categories. So to have the digit 9 there makes it a little bit easier to see what was the reason for creating this category, how is it being defined. So these two, having a 0 and a 9 at the end, are not strict rules, but somehow they make it a bit easier to understand the codes when we are looking over the overall code structure and encounter these type of situations. So this will end our session now on national classifications, and in follow-up sessions we're going to look at the use of correspondence tables.